another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. We have a very exceptional guest today, someone who has been at the center of major conflicts over the past 7 decades, offering his expert legal opinions and insights from the war in Vietnam, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, South Africa at the height of the struggle against apartheid, and in the later stages of his career on the Israel-Palestine question. In those years, he has authored countless books and served in a number of high-profile positions. He's Professor of International Law at Princeton University, and more recently, in one of his last high-profile positions, he was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestine. I am, of course, speaking about Professor Richard Falk. Welcome to the show, Professor, and thank you for speaking to us.
I'm very happy to be with you. Look forward to our conversation.
We've invited Professor Falk to discuss his new book, Public Intellectual, The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim. This is a political memoir which chronicles his brilliant career. There are, of course, far too many topics for us to touch on, given the vast range of issues and the time we have, and given also the latest round of aggression in Gaza. So because of that, we'll dedicate most of our time on questions related to the later stages of his life on Palestine. But let's begin by asking, I mean, how are you doing now, Professor Falk? Where are you now? Where are you based at the moment?
Well, somewhat by accident, in a Turkish fishing village called Yalikavak. My wife is Turkish, and we come here quite often from our home in California. And we happened to be here when the COVID crisis erupted in the United States. And so we stayed around, we thought for a short time, till it subsided, but we're still here, and now Turkey's in the midst of a
That's right.
spike, but we're sufficiently self-isolating so we don't feel very threatened.
So you'll probably be there for a number of weeks, I presume.
Yes, we're planning to return at the end of October. We like to be here in Turkey during the summers because it's a very comfortable environment, and for the last few years it got us away from Trump for a while, and that was something worth doing.
Yeah, don't blame you. Let's begin our discussion about the book itself and start with the title. Our viewers, I assume, will be curious to know what the second part of the title means. I think people will know what the public intellectual means, but what is the meaning that you want people to grasp when you say Citizen Pilgrim?
Well, the whole title was, in a sense, imposed on me by my publisher. And I felt a little uncomfortable about branding myself as public intellectual. It sounded a bit too pretentious. But she persuaded me that what I had proposed was too obscure. And the subtitle about the life of a citizen pilgrim comes from a terminology that I had developed earlier in opposition both to typical patriotism or national citizenship and also to the idea of world citizen. My objection to world citizen arose because I think citizenship implies community, and there isn't any global community. And so to affirm world citizenship seems like a sentimental and misleading kind of conception. The UN was supposedly set up to encourage that kind of global solidarity and sentiment, but it turned out to be, at least in peace and security and high-profile issues, to be a collection of national interests dominated by the geopolitical powers. It was designed that way constitutionally. They were given a veto power, which in effect said they don't have to do anything they don't want to do, even if what they want to do violates international law. As a Mexican delegate put it after the UN was established and he was asked what sort of an organization it is, he said, we've created an organization that has the capacity to hold the weak accountable, but the strong have impunity. Or more graphically, we can control the mice, but the tigers run free. And so the UN and the whole idea of global community is something that is needed, but doesn't exist. And the idea of citizen pilgrim is someone who searches for a better future, is on a journey to a better future. And so it brings the dimension of time into the notion of citizenship, which is usually defined spatially or understood spatially in relation to your own country or in relation to the world, or possibly in Europe to the region. And
I think it's quite clear now what you mean by citizen pilgrim. I wonder what you make of the current wave of nationalism. I mean, and the regression of global solidarity. We've seen that across the world at the moment. So, I mean, for someone who's aspiring for a global citizenship and sees himself as someone on a pilgrim to find a better space and a place in the world, to promote this kind of universal brotherhood, what do you make of the current rise in wave of nationalism?
Well, the optimistic answer is to say that the sun always looks brighter when it's about to set. And one can see this rise of populist autocratic regimes around the world to be a reaction in part to the distortions created by neoliberal globalization. I think that was the fundamental structural development that made many people feel alienated from what was supposed to be a democratic, globalizing kind of governing process. And this is sort of a reaction to that, which tries to find enemies and scapegoats and doesn't face the reality, which is that one needs a humane globalism that addresses problems that are shared, and that hasn't been on the agenda of the countries that have the capability to really lead the world toward that kind of problem solving and more hopeful future. And so this, I regard this, especially the societies that democratically choose anti-democratic leaders, to be a kind of expression of alienation that is a unfortunate side effect of the moral failures of economic globalization. And the US, country I'm most familiar with, is clearly embraced Trump and Trumpism in that spirit. A lot of the people that were and remain his loyal followers were those most victimized by this inequality. And even though he never challenged the inequality, in fact, he accentuated it, he was seen as somebody who represented the alienated voice of people that had been forgotten. And so it's a strange, and each country, of course, has its own narrative, but you find countries like India and the Philippines and Brazil all choosing leaders freely who are not serve the interests of only a small percentage of the population.
So we began with a commentary on the present. Let's look back to your childhood for a second, briefly. Your book opens with an account of your childhood in New York. You speak about your Jewish heritage, your somewhat difficult relationship with your mother in particular, and your education in some of the most prestigious universities in the US. What are the key periods in those early formative years of your life, do you think, shaped your scholar, activist, 70-year career that you've had, and attuned you to injustices around the world in ways most people are quite oblivious?
It's puzzling, and one of the sort of satisfactions of struggling with a memoir of this sort is a certain process of self-discovery. And I sort of didn't realize how unhappy my childhood seemed in retrospect until I started writing this memoir. And I think what happened was that it slowed down my development and especially my political maturity, much beyond what was characteristic for people with my same social background. And perversely, this had certain advantages. For instance, I never would have gotten through the Princeton gatekeepers if I had been as activist as I became during the Vietnam War. In other words, if the lateness of my political maturity turned out to be a professional advantage, which is peculiar, of course. And it's partly explained by the fact I had a father that was very loving, but very militaristic and conservative. And he had been on an admiral's staff in World War I and never got over the experience. And he was a lawyer who was in the law firm as a young man that also included Franklin Roosevelt, yet he was a devoted opponent of the so-called New Deal, and in fact wrote a book against Roosevelt, even though Roosevelt wrote the foreword to my father, became a naval historian, and he wrote a lot of books on the Navy, in fact predicted World War II. He anticipated the Japanese challenge to American Pacific power. So all of that led me by accident and by stages toward discovering myself. And I was, it was facilitated in part by my exposure to the Vietnam War, which I originally opposed as a kind of mainstream realist who thought it was imprudent to try to do what the French had failed to do. But then I went to Vietnam and saw the whole conflict from the perspective of the victims of this high technology assault on a peasant society. And I was impressed by their culture and their the humanity of their leadership and lots of things led me away from this realism and toward an activist opposition to American foreign policy.
Is that the kind of activism that also took you to South Africa? Because you were part of the, well, you aided Mandela's colleagues in getting him released, and you were quite active in ending the South African apartheid. So speak a little bit about that, if you can, as well.
Well, I wouldn't claim to be active in that high profile way. What happened again as an accident, I was with a girlfriend at the time in the Netherlands on a leave of absence, and there was a case against South African apartheid at the International Court of Justice, and it was brought by Ethiopia and Liberia, and they had nobody that was qualified to present the international law argument against apartheid. And they somehow discovered that I was there, and I worked on that case, and that case made me visible to some people that were concerned with what was going on in South Africa. And so they asked me to observe a political trial of the leaders of the liberation movement in Namibia, what was then called Southwest Africa. And I met a lot of the South Africans and was exposed to apartheid. And it really was a forerunner or antecedent to my experience of the Israel-Palestine struggle. And I understood the character of an apartheid regime. I had the opportunity to meet people, including both Nelson Mandela after he was released from prison in the early 1990s, and earlier when I went there, Winnie Mandela, who was his longtime wife and activist. And I was impressed, as in Vietnam, by the opposition, not by the established order.
Shed a bit of light, if you can, on Mandela's views on Palestine. You mentioned in the book that Mandela and Desmond Tutu saw the Israeli treatment of the Palestinian people as a crime in many ways comparable, if not worse, than the treatment of black South Africans.
Yes, I think they both felt that way. They felt that it was an aggravated version of South African apartheid, and partly I think they didn't articulate it in this way, but I think it was a consequence of the fact that Israel was more dependent on repressive violence. The African majority, oddly enough, in South Africa was more submissive and by and large was more controllable than the Palestinians have proved to be, even though Palestinians in Israel are a minority, and they've been under military occupation, of course, for decades now. But I think, and Archbishop Tutu, who I actually had more interaction with and more recent, was very clear about this moral distinction, which he phrased in terms of the violence, but not so much attributing it to the fact that the South African regime was internally more successful in suppressing resistance. And of course, the timing was important. Israel was a settler colonial project that took hold while European colonialism was collapsing all over the world. And it ran counter to the flow of history in that sense. And it required, and the early, especially the right-wing Zionists understood this. Jabotinsky, who is the inspiration for the Likud party, and Netanyahu, he understood that the Palestinians would not be submissive, that they would resist, because there was this ideology of nationalism and the right of self-determination, which had surfaced after World War II and became the dominant ethos in the world. And of course, all the settler colonial states that legitimated themselves did so before World War II, and actually before World War I. If you think about Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, all of them had sufficiently subdued, ethnically cleansed, or used genocidal methods to control the native populations. And they all, for that, in that reason, made the resistance a lost cause. That, as we've seen in recent days, is not the case for the Palestinians.
No, it's not. And I think one of the reasons why people confuse as to why there's a lot more resistance to the Israeli issue over many other conflicts around the world is partly to do with that. The fact that you have a pre-colonial, settler colonial movement in a post-colonial era. And there's a sense that, we were supposed to have left that period of our history. But as Israel shows, that isn't really the case. And which explains a lot of why there's so much resistance towards Israeli occupation. But let's move quickly to your appointments in the UN. You've served in a number of capacities within the UN High Commission as a special rapporteur. I think altogether probably 8 to 12 years. I'm not exactly sure. But describe the challenges that come with the job of monitoring situations in the occupied territory. I mean, I ask because Israelis detained you a number of times, expelled you from their territory, and pretty soon we should have a international criminal court, which hopefully will start its investigation into Israeli war crimes. Given your experience, does the ICC have a mountain to climb in holding Israel to account? What do you think will happen on this issue, given your experience?
Well, it's very interesting, and of course, it's an immense symbolic victory for the Palestinian struggle, even if no one is brought to justice. Because what it's already done, is to validate the allegations of criminality that have been put forward in relation to Israel's pattern of occupation, and specifically in relation to the Great March of Return from Gaza in 2018-19, the settlement phenomenon, and the 2014 military attack on Israel, on Gaza. And beyond that, there are other crimes that would fall within the investigative jurisdiction of the ICC, and one's not clear how they will define the investigation. But the mountain to climb is a geopolitical mountain. It's not a mountain of establishing the evidence of criminality. It's not the normal problems that a prosecutor faces in a criminal investigation. There is certain to be resistance by Israel and the attempt to cast the entire proceeding as one of what Netanyahu referred to as pure anti-Semitism, which is a perverse characterization of what the ICC did. It was extremely careful with articulating the foundations and limitations of its security, of its jurisdiction and its authority to proceed. And then you have the United States in the background and some of the European countries, including the UK and Germany, objecting to proceeding against Israel because it's not the technical reason for the objection is that it's not a member of the ICC. It didn't sign the Rome Statute, which is the treaty governing the ICC. So I would distinguish sharply between the symbolic significance of the early decision by the chamber of the court, which validates the prosecutor's decision to investigate, and the substantive likelihood that no convictions, no indictments probably will ever emanate from the court. And that's been true throughout the international system's response to Israel's criminality. They can engage in fact-finding and determine that what Israel is doing violates international law and violates international morality, but they can't implement recommendations about what to do about it, because that's where geopolitics intervenes effectively to prevent any kind of enforcement action. And as I said earlier, this is the way the UN was intended to operate. And it was intended to be an institution that privileged the most powerful countries, although in less visible arenas within the UN system, like health or children or culture, a lot of other things, the UN is invaluable in the contributions it makes to a more decent world system. And it benefits a lot the countries in Africa and Asia, Latin America, by its less controversial and less visible activities. But don't look to the UN to transcend the domain of geopolitics.
Yeah, it always seems to be the case that when it comes to Israel-Palestine, the UN seems to short circuit on its normal processes. That's I think it's always the case. But I'm wondering, I mean, who would then take up what we are seeing at the moment in Gaza? There's allegations of war crimes. I think Amnesty has called for an investigation, especially following Israel's bombing of the press building, International Press Building. I mean, there's that, and there's also Palestinian citizens within Israel. It's for the first time in history, a coalition of Israeli Palestinian members of the Knesset and NGOs. They've issued a letter calling on the international community for protection following violence over the last couple of weeks, many of which were described as pogroms, mobs going out and attacking Palestinians. So in those kind of scenarios, what would be the remedy? Who would take up those issues, those calls, especially with regards to the Palestinians in Israel at the moment?
I think that there may be, as in the past, a commission appointed to consider what can be done, and it will have high-profile report. It'll be denounced by Israel and the US and maybe some of the European countries. It will confirm the concerns of the letter, and it will recommend that the issues be referred to the International Criminal Court, but nothing will happen. See, until you can find a way, either from internal changes in countries such as the US or possibly the EU, to override the primacy of geopolitics, you can't enforce against those actors what they don't want enforced. When they want the UN to be formidable and strong, as in Libya in 2011, they make the UN do more than it should be doing. And they validated what amounted to a regime-changing intervention that executed the legitimate leader. But when, as here, the geopolitical cards are stacked against the Palestinians, you can't look to the UN to be effective. But what you can look to is for a mobilization beyond what has occurred in the past in global civil society among people, and it is from populist agitation that real pressure came. And in this context, it's helpful to look at what did lead to the downfall of South African apartheid. It wasn't an armed struggle, and it wasn't the UN enforcing something on South Africa, even though it didn't enjoy the intensity of geopolitical support that Israel does. It was a combination of internal resistance and global solidarity. And that's what's going to make the change. And I think we may be at what I call a Sharpeville moment in relation to the Palestinian struggle. Sharpeville, you remember, was the massacre in 1960 of unarmed African demonstrators against apartheid and against the past laws that were.
Are you saying that because of what's happening within Israel itself now, the Palestinian citizens of Israel being under such assault and attack? Is that the reason? Because that is a new dimension that's just opened up within the conflict.
It's also the expressions of Palestinian unity, the protesters at the borders of Lebanon and Jordan, the interference with Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, the expulsion of the families from Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, all of those, it's a kind of gestalt that is different than in the past intervals of violence against Gaza or even the regional wars. This is something that has, for whatever reasons, has had a greater mobilizing effect. And that, as what you point out, the communal violence in Israel, in the towns where Arabs and Jews live together, that's never happened before on this scale. And all of that really negates the idea that was during the Trump years that the Palestinians were defeated.
You could bypass the whole thing and then create peace with Israel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We are running out of time, Professor Falk, and I wanted to get two more questions in, and one was really to get your thoughts on the Human Rights Watch report on Israel being stated as committing apartheid, a crime of apartheid. Sorry, I mean you had a fallout with Human Rights Watch previously. And I'm wondering whether, I mean, throughout your time, from what I saw, you've always managed to be on the right side of history, whether it be Vietnam, South Africa, so many other issues. And Human Rights Watch recently also came out with a report, basically, as you know, calling Israel an apartheid state. So do you feel a sense of vindication in the way many of the events have unfolded, especially Israel-Palestine?
I guess it's a mixture of feeling that kind of vindication. I co-authored this report on apartheid for the UN after my time as Special Rapporteur was over, and it was at the time, it was the most detailed academic study
That's right.
that concluded that the policies and practices of Israel constituted the crime of apartheid under the 1972 International Convention on the Crime of Apartheid. And that was denounced by Nikki Haley, the American ambassador in the Security Council, and I was attacked personally as the discredited author of that report. And it started this process, I think, of normalizing the allegation of apartheid. It became much more discussed. And then the B'Tselem report of a few months ago, which concluded that both Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories constituted an apartheid regime, and culminating in this very long human rights report. And that, from a political point of view, that's an enormous development. Again, it has a primary symbolic value as allowing the Palestinian struggle to gain control over the moral and legal arguments. And all of the anti-colonial wars have been won, and the political outcomes controlled not by the stronger side militarily or on the battlefield, but on the side that wins what I call the legitimacy war. And the Palestinians are winning the legitimacy war. And that's something that I couldn't have anticipated even 5 years ago when we wrote this report. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that both of these recent reports use a territorial conception of apartheid, which situates it, as in South Africa, in relation to land. Our report tried to relate the notion of apartheid, the Israeli version of apartheid, to the Palestinian people, because Israel has deliberately fragmented the Palestinians so as they could both control them more easily and so they could claim to be a democracy. The whole process of ethnic cleansing has to do with Israel trying to legitimate itself by saying it was, you recall the phrase, the only democracy in the Middle East. That was always a perversion of the reality, because it was really the only apartheid regime in the Middle East. Because from the very beginning, the state of Israel was premised on the postulate of Jewish supremacy. And Jewish supremacy in the face of Palestinian resistance, that spells apartheid. I mean, that's what apartheid is, the victimization. But the Jewish narrative, the Zionist narrative, was so powerful and the Holocaust was so recent that people didn't really critically explore it, including myself, for quite a number of years, didn't sort of dare say that. And even Edward Said never said that, as far as I know. Because there was a feeling that you couldn't quite assault the Jewish experience in light of its historical antecedents.
Yeah, but something has happened over the last couple of weeks, the way the media has responded, and apartheid has become a widely used word to describe what's happening in Israel in a way which, as you mentioned, was unthinkable just a couple of years ago. But I do want to end with one final question before we conclude, which is, you've been nominated every year. You're nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. For whatever reason, you're prevented from. What's all that about? And do you think you will finally get a Nobel Peace Prize?
No, I think it's very a remote possibility. A lot.
You are appointed quite regularly, from what I read.
Yes. No, I've been nominated annually, sometimes by Norwegian legislators.
That's right.
A variety of people, academic people sometimes. But the Nobel Prize Committee has been pretty mainstream in its idea of who the recipients of the prize should be. They tended to favor people that were opposing kind of obviously autocratic movements in different parts of the world that were not so geopolitically sensitive. See, this is really geopolitical. It would be viewed, because of the attacks on me, as somehow rewarding anti-Semitism or some perverse thing like that.
It's the one area where the Nobel Peace Prize is highly tribal. Geopolitical considerations are, at stake here. So I guess that is why. But if anyone deserves one, I suppose, for all your 70 decades of work in various countries in various capacities, you do deserve one. We have come to the end of our time. I just want to say, thank you and for giving us your time. It's been a wonderful conversation. Enjoy your time in Turkey. And stay safe.
Thank you, Nassim. It was very good talking with you, and I hope we covered the ground you wanted us to.
Oh, we have, and I'll see you soon. And the viewers at home, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye. Take care.
Goodbye.